Yours. This is a rectangular gavel, but it ought to work. The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members will have 5 days rather, to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The U.S. oil and gas industry is a force multiplier for American influence around the world. For decades, many of the planet's great energy producers were regimes ruled by tyrants who leveraged their oil wealth to oppress their own people and pursue evil foreign policy. However, thanks to American know-how, the United States has unleashed its own energy potential, now becoming a major player on the global market. I should say the major player. In large part, America's revival as an energy superpower is a result of shale revolution. Through the process of hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it is called, which was invented in the 40s and expanded recently to be more efficient, we're now able to reach oil and gas deep within the earth where they were previously unreachable. With this new technology, the U.S. has gone from the world's largest oil importer to one of the world's largest energy exporters. The United States primarily imports heavy crude oil and exports light crude, or Texas sweet crude as we call it. Just a decade ago, the U.S. was importing 12.5 million barrels per day of crude oil and fuel, and now it's just 4 billion. Between 2010 and 2017, oil production rose from 5 million barrels per day to 10 million barrels a day, approaching a record last set in 1970. This has allowed for a dramatic reduction of our dependence on foreign oil, which ultimately strengthens our national security. The United States has been talking about being energy independent since I was born. I'm glad to see that we're finally getting to that point. In nearly 3 years since Congress entered restrictions on exporting crude oil, the U.S. has beat market expectations and surged its exports to a record 2.5 million barrels. And by 2022, we will export more oil than we import. Some people wonder why we export and import both oil. The United States uses heavy crude in its refineries, and it's too expensive to switch from heavy crude to light crude, so we import our heavy crude, and then we export the light crude that other nations use that we develop quite rapidly. Also, we have natural gas production that has been setting new records in every year since 2000. Thanks to the innovations of liquefied natural gas, LNG as we call it, we ship this growing resource anywhere in the world. Last year, we had become the next exporter of natural gas for the first time in 60 years. In the coming years, it'll only improve as the market of natural gas consumers grow and more exporting facilities come online. America's comeback as an energy superpower has wide-ranging geopolitical implications besides the economic benefits to the United States and other countries. Its obvious benefit for Americans in the U.S. economy reduces our trade balance and creates new, well-paying jobs. And it also generates more revenue, making us a stronger nation. But it also means less money that's going into repressive regimes all over the world who were previously we were dependent on for oil. And since energy is more abundant, the price of oil is decreasing. Overall, the result is less money for Putin's Russia, the Ayatollah's Iran, and Maduro's Venezuela, all totalitarian regimes that oppress their people, and they make their living by selling oil and gas. With the low price of oil, international sanctions, and their own economic mismanagement, these regimes who could rely on oil wealth to fund their activities, their nefarious activities, are instead sinking in their economic tank. Now the people on the streets demanding accountability, and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have long been important partners of the U.S. because we needed their oil and their leverage in stabilizing oil prices. Now we can redefine our relationship with these countries as well. This does not mean we should become isolationists or abandon our traditional partners. It just means we should work better. We have oil, we have natural gas, and we need to give the Europeans a alternative to the blackmail from Russia and Russian natural gas, especially Eastern Europe. Several years ago, I was in Ukraine and in the winter, and the Russians turned off the gas. It was dark, it was cold, and people died. And they did it for political reasons, to try to put their muscle on Ukraine, which they're still trying to do. But that's just one example of the way the Russians use natural gas as a way to force other countries to deal with them politically. And also, U.S. oil and gas exports reinforces the importance of free trade. I'm a free trader. I think we should, that includes NAFTA, but we need to make NAFTA a fair and free trade as well, which talks are going on now. About 60% of U.S. gas exports go to Mexico, providing a major boost to our trade balance. And Canada has become a major importer of American refined fuels. I have long thought that the United States, the four countries of Canada, the United States, Texas, and Mexico, should work together to have a North American alliance on energy. We could become the energy major player in the world on all types of energy if we just worked a little bit more together to make sure that we can use that as an economic advantage, but also as a geopolitical tool against these totalitarian regimes. So I'm looking forward to hearing what our witnesses have to say on these issues, and give us some insight, and also are there things that Congress needs to do or not do to make sure that the United States continues its energy exploration. I will now turn to my friend from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for his opening statement and comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for letting us all know your true beliefs that Texas is a sovereign country. And it's something we suspected.
You didn't know that?
Well, I do now. I know it now. So I'll bring that message back to Massachusetts. I would like to thank the chairman for convening today's hearing. This is an important topic because there are a lot of factors that make development efforts more effective and enhance our national and global security. However, there are fewer things that, without them, there simply cannot be development or economic growth, and adequate levels of security would be really impossible to achieve, and energy is one of those things. U.S. oil and gas exports, the topic of our hearing today, are an interesting piece of the global energy puzzle and shouldn't be considered lightly, both in terms of the possible impact on our own energy policy and national security, but on those of many other countries as well. With the decision to export oil and natural gas, we also have the opportunity to be highly strategic in thinking about our energy export policies and the geopolitical context they create. For example, some European countries have considered importing U.S. LNG to reduce the reliance on Russia to meet their energy needs. While we're facing Russia's destabilizing interventions around the world, including our own democratic elections here in the United States, we have to pay attention to shifts like this that open up new opportunities to promote our own strategic interests abroad. In fact, energy was one sector proposed for inclusion in the now stalled transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the EU, with the idea of bringing lower barriers to exporting U.S. oil and gas to our friends and allies in Europe. Additionally, two of our largest LNG customers are Canada and Mexico. If the President does, in fact, withdraw from NAFTA, that will have a big effect on the sector and on thousands of jobs that support this industry here in the United States. Even in my own sovereign country, Massachusetts, which is not an oil or natural gas producing state, we support these industries with manufacturing and service sectors and contribute a significant percentage of labor income to the crude oil supply chain here in the United States. Our oil and gas export policy has the potential to shape the lives of countless Americans, not only in daily economic terms here, but in how we ultimately we're impacted by the effects of our export policies abroad. And just as we cannot be blind to the countless economic and geopolitical implications of our U.S. oil and gas export policy, we must also be vigilant about putting this policy in context. In a post-Paris climate agreement world, there's a nearly universal commitment to addressing the impacts of climate change. Investments in clean energy and renewables will be a big part of that, not just for the U.S. and other countries, but for developing economies as well. The effects of global markets for oil and gas should also be part of our conversation about the makeup of U.S. energy exports. What will be the breakdown of our energy exports? How much will oil and gas be a part of that? How much will renewable energy be part of that? We're already seeing the reverse of this here in the United States. In my district, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Danish companies are involved in the development of wind energy in what will be one of the biggest offshore wind energy projects in the country. Energy is a global issue. This can be a boon for American workers and American households and companies looking to have a consistent and affordable energy year-round to heat and cool their homes and, importantly, to grow their businesses. Or it can be a series of missed opportunities. Our conversation today highlights oil and gas. However, it would be a mistake to ignore how these different sources of energy fit together to provide security and reliable economic growth, and to ignore the inevitable long-term trajectories of our energy policies. In choosing to export oil and gas, we've opened up a world of opportunities for interacting with other countries, global markets, conflicts, and even foreign policy considerations that go along with it. However, that still means we must evaluate this policy in the context of our own energy and economic priorities, our long-term security interests, and the realities of the foreign policy challenges that we do face. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, for an opening comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me note that energy and our ability to be self-sufficient in energy, or how much energy we will have to feed our economy, has been a major factor for decades, and we didn't quite realize that until America became a net importer of oil and gas a decade or several decades ago. Before that, I mean, we didn't give it much thought. And let's just note that once it was clear that America was headed towards a shortage of oil and gas, we still had people in our country who opposed the Alaskan pipeline. Had they been successful, Mr. Chairman, in preventing the Alaskan pipeline, because I understand caribou it was going to hurt the caribou. Of course, those predictions have proven exactly the opposite. Now we have more caribou, but that fanaticism that had them opposing the Alaskan pipeline would have had a huge negative impact on our economy, and also would have made us even more vulnerable during this time period when we've been importing oil. Well, we face the same kind of thing with fracking, where fanatics have opposed fracking, but yet that has given us now a new self-sufficiency. All of these things have incredible foreign policy implications as well as economic implications for our country, and we need to understand them, and thank you for holding this hearing so we will have a better understanding.
Thank the gentleman from California. I will introduce our witnesses, and without objection, all witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. Please keep your comments in your presentation to no more than 5 minutes, and we will have your presentation filed in the minutes of the hearing. Dr. Kenneth Medlock is the Senior Director of the Center of Energy Studies at Rice University, Baker Institute for Public Policy. Previously, he served as Vice President for Conferences in the United States Association for Energy Economics. Dr. Medlock, thank you for being here, and thank you for what you do at Rice University. Very good reputation. Mr. David Carroll is the President and CEO of Gas Technology Institute. Since 2015, Mr. Carroll has also been President of the International Gas Union, which is made up of 150 member associations, and corporations representing 97% of the global gas market. Mrs. Sarah Ladishaw is Director of the Energy National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, she worked in the Office of the Americas in the Department of Energy. And Ms. Samantha Gross is a fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institute and a fellow at the Gross Brookings Initiative on Energy and Climate. Previously, she served as Director of International Climate and Clean Energy at the Department of Energy. Mr. Medlock, we'll start with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Keating. I also want to thank the committee for accommodating me during the past week. I'll take a moment just to make, my grandfather passed away. He was a World War II veteran of the Navy, a member of the Mighty Midgets. For those of you who don't know history, you can look it up. It's a pretty decorated group. And he was very proud of his accomplishments, but also very understated, which I think is a quality that I hope many others will emulate. Regarding this particular testimony, shale has been utterly transformative, and that's where I want to start, because if we're going to have a conversation about U.S. soft power and U.S. Foreign policy prerogative related to oil and gas, we have to acknowledge what's happened domestically on the shale front. It's been transformative in more than just how most of us talk about it. So most of us talk about it as if there's a new source of supply that has emerged into the global market scene. It's actually resulted in a reduction in import dependence in the United States. We've seen our crude oil imports drop dramatically. We're now net exporters of natural gas as well as petroleum products or refined products. But an important, I think, lesson in all of this, and this is really what plays into the broader discussion about geopolitical ramifications, are if you go back to 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, the world was really looking at the U.S. as a declining oil and gas province, a province that ultimately you would continue to see declines in production, growth in demand, increasing import dependence. There were a lot of very significant investments made in a vertically integrated way to develop natural gas in remote parts of the world, move it through liquefaction facilities onto ships, and bring it to our shores. Back in 2003, there were 47 different terminals that had received certification to import liquefied natural gas. Now, all of those, of course, didn't get built, but it was certainly a signal. What drove that? Well, oftentimes we forget, and it's not that long ago, but between 2003 and 2006, the price of natural gas in the United States was higher than anywhere else in the world. And of course, when you start talking about trade, you start talking about impetus for investment. At the end of the day, it really is about moving product from a low price to a high price. And that's exactly what was happening. Of course, when you have high prices, it also stimulates other margins of response. And that's exactly what happened in the domestic upstream. It wasn't the vertically integrated majors. It was a lot of relatively small, sometimes referred to as mom and pops, but independents, that really took entrepreneurial spirit to task in the upstream. In the Barnett Shale, for example, Mitchell Energy went in and actually started to try new things. In the Fort Worth Basin, as it was previously known. Drilling some vertical wells, making contact with what was known to exist for a long time. Geologists have been talking about shales for decades. This is not new to a geologist, but figuring out ways to make the resource both technically and commercially recoverable was really the big challenge. It was a challenge that was put on the table by policymakers in the late 1970s. With the Eastern Gas Shales Project. It was taken on board by various institutions, including the Gas Technology Institute. But ultimately what happened is you saw these high prices that matriculated into the United States as a result of demand growth and declining production result in significant innovation. The key thing about the United States that I think is sometimes lost in the context of understanding what's happening domestically and what it means globally is that we enjoy a very unique set of regulatory and legal institutions in this country that have afforded us the ability to see our production grow. It actually fosters innovation. It fosters entrepreneurial activity. And when you have that kind of environment, the sky's the limit, quite frankly. What I just said is not unique to oil and gas, though. It's actually true across the energy value chain. So it is actually imperative that the United States is going to continue to project its influence globally. One of the things that the U.S. government continue to foster policies and environments that are conducive to entrepreneurial activity. Couple of final statements along those lines. Gas, what's happened here, the Marcellus is to gas what the Permian is to oil. A lot of people don't think have fully internalized that, but when we start talking about what's going to happen over the next decade in the oil space, we've just begun to scratch the surface. The big issue right now is water and infrastructure. The same thing could have been said about the Marcellus, particularly with regard to infrastructure not too long ago. So when we look at what the Marcellus has meant for the North American natural gas scene, it's important to recognize that the Permian is likely to unveil the same sort of dramatic transformation in not only the U.S. oil market, but the global oil market. On the gas front, the U.S. now presents what we call a credible threat to Russian hegemonic intent in Europe. You've seen this in Lithuania with the construction of its natural gas import facility. Prices were instantly renegotiated once that happened because now Russia realizes there is something out there that can actually take market. And that is something that is incredibly important when you start talking about foreign policy objectives and geopolitical influence. And the U.S. is on the cusp of actually having significant impacts globally for the next several decades as a result of what's happened domestically. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Medlock. Mr. Carroll.
Thank you. Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity to provide some testimony today. David Carroll, president of the Gas Technology Institute, a Chicago-based independent not-for-profit research organization that turns raw technology into meaningful high-impact energy solutions that benefit both the economy and the environment. And I have the current additional honor of serving as the president of the International Gas Union. My term wraps up next month as the U.S. prepares to host the World Gas Conference right here in Washington. As my colleague Dr. Medlock just indicated, while shale gas might seem like an overnight success to many, decades of research by GTI, the U.S. Department of Energy, and industry really provided the technical understanding needed to produce this abundant resource. And when GTI and Mitchell Energy back in 1991 completed the first horizontal well in the Barnett, the U.S. energy transformation had begun. So you fast forward to today, and oil and gas production from U.S. shale has become the world's swing supply, arguably the biggest energy breakthrough in the last 50 years. The oil and gas sector generates $1.2 trillion in GDP and over 9 million U.S. jobs. But a powerful impact of shale gas is the reduced prices to everyday consumers and families. Increased use of gas in electricity generation has reduced CO2 emissions from the power sector by 27%. U.S. net energy imports have decreased from 30% of our total energy needs in 2005 to about 7% last year. And with the expansion of domestic energy production from multiple sources, including renewables, and steady strides in energy efficiency, we are approaching energy independence. Shale gas has also enabled greater participation in the global gas market. Let me give you a few stats from IGU's 2018 World LNG report, which is issuing next month. Global trade in LNG last year grew by 10%, or 35 million tons, as projects in Australia and the United States came online. China alone represented 1/2 of the global growth in LNG last year, as it shifts its energy mix toward natural gas and away from coal in its effort to fight air pollution. Qatar remains the world's largest LNG exporter, with about 30% of the global market. Australia was second. The U.S. was sixth. There are over 90 million tons of liquefaction capacity that are under construction right now. About a third of that comes on stream this year in 6 countries, including Australia, the U.S., and Russia. So U.S. LNG now competes in a dynamic market with an increasing number of producers and consumers. And yes, we are now a major exporter. But our success is not assured. Our competitors are not standing still. They're investing, they're expanding. So efforts we must make to enhance productivity and upstream production, expand transportation networks, and liquefaction processes are necessary to keep pace. A few comments about demand. About 70% of global demand in liquefied natural gas will occur in non-OECD countries. And let's take India, for example, which has an ambitious goal of increasing gas in its energy mix from 6% today to 15% over the next 15 years. LNG imports are going to play a role, as will more domestic production, nationwide pipeline construction, and new city gas distribution networks. Helping India enhance its energy security, promoting its economic development, and improving the environment is in our interest as a country. Last June, President Trump and Prime Minister Modi announced the U.S.-India Strategic Energy Partnership, affirming the importance of our bilateral relationship. Secretary Perry recently traveled to New Delhi, where he and Energy Minister Pradhan co-chaired the inaugural meeting of this partnership. As GTI's CEO, I've been in India over 3 times in the last 18 months and have executed MOUs with 2 institutions to train India's expanding energy workforce. So these are indeed exciting times for natural gas in India, to use them as an example, now the world's 4th largest importer of LNG. So in conclusion, innovation in the natural gas sector affords opportunities to enhance our economy, create jobs, save consumers money, and engage in global trade. It's bolstered our energy security and really given us the flexibility in dealing with strategic partners around the world. It's important to remember that this success didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. So sustaining our progress will require continued investments in research and infrastructure. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. Ms. Lattisall.
Good afternoon, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and members of the subcommittee. It's my pleasure to be here to talk with you today about the geopolitics of U.S. oil and gas competitiveness. My remarks and written testimony represent my views and not those of my colleagues and my institution. As has been stated, the United States has experienced an oil and natural gas production renaissance that's changed the domestic and global energy landscape in some really important ways. The most direct linkage between U.S. oil and gas competitiveness and geopolitics is the contribution it makes to global and U.S. energy security. First, it provides additional supply to a previously tight market. Second, U.S. tight oil adds a new kind of supply to the market that takes months rather than years to ramp up and can serve it as a relief valve when markets are tight. Third, the new oil and gas supply source has added a sense of resource optimism to the market. Today, producers, consumers, and investors understand that given the right price environment and investment conditions, new oil and gas supplies can be brought to market. The U.S. oil and natural gas supply surge is also good for the U.S. economy and national security, as has also been mentioned. Oil and gas production in the United States is an important source of job creation, economic growth, has provided crucial stimulus to the economy during the post-Great Recession period, and improves our balance of trade. The benefits of U.S. oil and gas competitiveness should not, however, obscure the risks that still exist to U.S. energy security. Despite the rising level of exports, the United States still imports a good deal of oil and natural gas. As we approach a new hurricane season, it's important not to forget the oil, gas, and electricity supply disruptions that resulted from Hurricanes Harvey and Irma in 2017. Finally, even the abundant supply of domestic oil and natural gas is not a direct proxy for security. Delivery systems are needed to get resources from the point of production to the point of consumption, and in many cases we experience bottlenecks in that part of the energy system. The U.S. oil and gas supply renaissance is also a good news story for the places where energy intersects with geopolitics. First, as I noted in my June 27 testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, North America is now one of the most energy-advantaged regions on the planet. The energy resources contained in Canada, Mexico, and the United States are second to none, and when combined with the region's stable legal system, liberalized trading environment, cross-border infrastructure, high-tech industries, and educated and competitive labor force, it's hard to match in terms of its potential. It's important to look at the U.S. relationship with Canada and Mexico as an opportunity to build on these natural advantages. Second, U.S. oil and gas can add to the diversity of supply available to other countries in helpful ways. One key example is the impact of additional supplies have made available to Europe. The availability of additional supply sources was part of the equation that led to the capture of, the departure of oil index pricing in long-term gas contracts in Europe. As my colleague at CSIS has recently written, this does not mean Europe is less dependent on Russia for its gas supplies necessarily. In 2017, Europe actually increased gas imports from Russia along with other countries. The additional import options and availability of global supplies are, of course, good for Europe's gas supply security, but has not in reality lessened the energy ties between Europe and Russia, nor has it fundamentally changed the geopolitical dynamics within the region with regard to Ukraine. Third, major oil-producing economies like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and other members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, have had to reevaluate a number of oil market and geopolitical factors as it relates to U.S. tight oil production. First, the oil price drop in 2014 that resulted from a variety of factors, including the rapid onset of U.S. oil supply growth and subsequent period of low prices, caused OPEC to reevaluate its position within the market, both in 2014 and again in 2016. In order to be effective, Saudi Arabia, as the leader of OPEC, struck up an alliance with Russia and several other non-OPEC countries to withhold oil supply from the market in order to stabilize prices until markets came to rebalance. It's unclear how deep and abiding the alliance between Russia and Saudi Arabia is beyond their current market management arrangement, but the relationship has been accompanied by a deepening of Russian diplomatic and investment activity throughout the Middle East. The second effect on major supplying countries is the area of economic planning and diversification. The most notable example of this is the Economic and Social Reform Plan launched in 2016 called Saudi Vision 2030. Through this plan, Saudi Arabia intends to revamp its domestic economy to rely less on oil and diversify its income sources. Leaving the challenges of implementing this vision aside, it's important to note that many countries that depend on oil-derived revenue to fund their governments have taken steps to insulate their economies from periods of sustained low prices. This, of course, has been done in the face of low oil prices, so the sustainability of those reforms may be in question when prices rise again, but the reforms were a direct result of the oil price drop brought on by U.S. supply. Notably, countries like Venezuela, once among the largest and most successful oil-producing countries in the world, have suffered a great deal under the pressure of low oil prices after years of neglect and mismanagement under the current and previous leadership. One often hears it asserted that the increased production of U.S. oil and gas has served to lessen U.S. reliance or entanglement in the Middle East. In fact, this has hardly been the case. The perceived U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East was sparked by a desire to draw down on the wartime posture of the Middle East and shift the strategic focus to striking a security balance in Asia. The U.S. is no freer from entanglements in the Middle East than it was before the onset of U.S. oil and gas supply revolution. Though it is less concerned about energy security thanks to the low oil price environment of the last several years. Following the recent announcement of the U.S. intention to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran Agreement, the Trump administration showed that the U.S. still relies on Middle East oil supplies to help guarantee price stability in the region. As I have written in other publications, energy and foreign policy are often inextricably intertwined, but the ability for policymakers to use energy resources as a tool of targeted foreign policy leverage or even energy dominance is misguided. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Ms. Gross.
Thank you to Chairman Poe, to Ranking Member Keating, for the invitation to testify today. I'm Samantha Gross. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Foreign Policy, and my work focuses on energy and environmental geopolitics. As everyone here has said today, the renaissance in U.S. oil and natural gas production over the past decade has been nothing short of remarkable. Technological advances unlocked new resources, and in 2013 made the U.S. the world's leading producer of petroleum hydrocarbons. We talk now about peak oil demand, whereas not that long ago in my career, we were all focused on peak oil supply and whether we were going to run out of oil. And a big part of that change in attitude has been the change in U.S. production. But nonetheless, we still import millions of barrels of oil each day at prices set on the global market based on global trends. the United States is not influenced from the ups and downs of global oil prices and how they react to world events. For example, today's prices at the pump reflect the upcoming reimposition of sanctions on Iran and also Venezuela's plummeting oil production. Even though we are still a significant net oil importer, growing U.S. oil production has changed the balance of power in the global oil market. For example, as others have talked about, crude oil prices took a nosedive in late 2014. The average oil price in 2015 and 2016 was less than half of what it had been for the previous 4 years. OPEC finally decided to act at the end of 2016 to reduce its production and try to push up prices. But in an unprecedented move, it teamed up with Russia to make this happen, a signal of OPEC's declining power and also of the supply glut that growing U.S. production had created. Unlike for oil, the U.S. is a net exporter of natural gas and has been the world's largest gas producer since 2009. And greater U.S. influence abroad is really more likely to be a gas story than an oil story. For one reason, natural gas trade differs in important ways from trade in oil. Gas is more difficult to transport and to store, and so expensive infrastructure and long-term contracts also often tie buyers and sellers together. This less liquid market means that gas sometimes can be more political, as we see in Russian gas trade and the fact that they sometimes have Europe over a barrel with gas pipelines. Another important reason for the greater influence of gas is that the world is shifting towards natural gas as a preferred fuel. Natural gas has the lowest carbon emissions of any fossil fuel, creates much lower local air pollution than coal, and is a natural partner to renewables in power production, since gas-fired power can start up and ramp up and down very quickly in response to changes in renewable energy production and demand. This global shift towards gas plays into the U.S. strength in natural gas production and can also help move the world towards a lower carbon energy system. Mexico is today the largest consumer of U.S. natural gas, and we now, as a result of this trade, have an energy trade surplus with Mexico. Last year, the value of energy exports to Mexico were more than twice the value of energy imports from Mexico. As others have mentioned, U.S. LNG is also a supply source that could somewhat reduce Europe's dependence on natural gas from Russia. Today, U.S. LNG supply is just getting warmed up, and exports to Europe right now are quite small. But the promise of more supply to come, not just from the United States, but from others as well, gives Europe a bit more leverage with Russia in terms of natural gas supply. The U.S. is now a crucial source of global oil and gas supply. But amid all this talk about energy influence, I want us to keep one important thing in mind. And that is that the U.S. energy industry is not structured to use its production towards geopolitical ends. Unlike the national companies, oil companies of OPEC, the U.S. industry is made up of dozens of companies that make individual investment and production decisions based on profits, not on policy. The U.S. supply of price-responsive, non-political oil and gas contributes to well-functioning global energy markets and reduces the influence of those who want to use their oil and gas supply towards political ends. And this provides a benefit to energy consumers everywhere. But oil and gas companies generally aren't tools of U.S. foreign policy. We also must remember that the United States is a major oil and gas consumer as well as a producer. Particularly for oil, our energy security depends on the global market. Supply disruptions, as Sarah pointed out, don't just happen abroad. Hurricanes and floods have brought serious disruptions in our domestic energy supply. Our interconnections with the world and our variety of suppliers are key to U.S. energy security, a source of strength and resilience rather than of weakness. This concludes my prepared remarks, but I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank all members of the panel. Without objection, the chair will recognize the gentleman from Florida first, Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. And Ms. Ladislaw, I wanted to hit you on this, but I was also glad to hear you speak about this, Ms. Gross. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what's going on, not just with supply disruption. I think we're a little bit more familiar with what that can look like here in the United States of America. But when we branch out and we look at supply disruption in terms of what can happen in Qatar, in Australia, obviously you could be looping in the relationship with the proximity of Iran when we're talking about Qatar. But more specifically, Australia and Russia, what are the natural disaster supply disruptions that we could see affecting the chains in those places?
I'll start and then turn it to Sam. I mean, I think when you look at Australia, it's not a natural disaster supply disruption, but Australia has a really important example of a story that is meaningful to the U.S. It built out a huge amount of natural gas export capacity, and then experienced a position where their domestic industries were paying prices that were higher than the export markets to which they were selling natural gas, and they had to threaten to curtail natural gas exports from Australia as a result of that. And that was just because they weren't able to, expand supplies enough for their domestic market. It was something that took lots and lots of people by surprise, but it harkens back to that midstream infrastructure comment that I brought before, which is you can have all the gas in the world, but if it's in the ground and it can't get to the people that need it, it doesn't do anybody any good. And so there's a lot of domestic politics in Australia right now that are really centered around this idea of we've got to make sure we make the domestic market whole as well as be able to, meet our export arrangements. It's not geopolitical, it's not sexy, it's just business, right? And so I think it was probably one of the things that took the U.S. government so long when it came to exporting LNG facilities here in the U.S. To getting those permits right. There was a concern here whether the domestic resource base would be adequate enough for us to support the export of gas and also meet those needs here. So kind of a wonky logistical issue, one that we seem to have gotten beyond, but Australia thought they got beyond it too, and then it kind of hit them in the face unexpectedly.
Brief comment to that, and that is that there was definitely concern when the Department of Energy was starting to approve LNG exports, that it would push up domestic gas prices. We haven't seen that thus far. Granted, LNG industry is just getting warmed up here. But one thing that I think points to the fact that we may get this right is that you see a lot of industries coming back to the United States based on the promise of low gas prices. In particular, there's been a real renaissance in chemical industry here in the United States. And so they're making significant financial bets on the fact that gas prices in the U.S. will remain quite reasonable. And so, we'll see what happens, but there's significant money betting that that will go right.
Sticking with that same triangle of nations, could you point to any differences on the broad strokes in terms of what creates competitive advantages and disadvantages based upon environmental regulation for the refinement and the production of natural gas? Or rather the mining. Thank you.
Within those three countries? So
yes,
that's a good
Australia,
question.
Russia.
I'm not sure I've got the best answer for what creates competitive advantage. All three economies function very differently in terms of how they pursue both domestic gas production, export, and investment for petrochemicals. I think one of the interesting things is for a long time, both Russia and Qatar functioned as the least cost producers of gas with a readily available resource base, and therefore they had a natural advantage to refining and petrochemical industries in terms of what they were able to invest. The U.S. has been able to do a heck of a lot more of that business in recent years as a result of that. In terms of environmental permitting, I really can't speak to that issue.
Does anybody on the panel have anything to offer in terms of broad stroke differences between environmental permitting across those nations? I'll take that. Yes, sir.
Yes, I would just say that in the case of Russia in particular, I think the lack of available data, especially with regard to environmental impact, methane emissions and the like, is a little more suspect and a little less available. That said, some of the major producers are working to mitigate those emissions, as one example.
Thank you. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you for the time.
Thank the gentleman from Florida. The chair recognizes the gentleman from the Republic of Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry if you lost Dr. Medlock. The overall rosy picture, before I get into international issues, a quick domestic question, though. The impression was the U.S. is going to be in a great position, flowing with cheaper, cleaner energy. But there are portions of the United States that may not have as rosy a forecast. Now, where I am in Massachusetts, sometimes the access issues become difficult, and we face some problems there. Are there other parts of the country, and how does a place like that cope with those problems? Dr. Carroll, if you want to start.
First thing you did this winter was get a ship of LNG in from Russia, from the Yamal plant, which helped deal with the, in order to keep your heat going and your power being generated there. That's clearly, as I look across the United States, the biggest constraint in pipeline capacity is in that New England, New York area, which constrains the flow of gas both into the northeastern U.S. And eastern Canada as well. And it's a shame, given the huge quantities of affordable gas that are located in Marcellus, just a couple hundred miles away. So as I see it, that would be a critical opportunity to increase the infrastructure. That said, how do you get around it today? You can import, as you did with LNG through the Everett terminal in Massachusetts. You can, of course, move more toward renewables as best you can to minimize the demand for fossil fuels. But as again, I look across the country, that pinch point up there is probably the most acute.
Yeah, and they're decommissioning a nuclear plant there too. So, anyone else have anything to add about the U.S. difficulties?
Thank you for the question, and I think this actually brings up a great opportunity to draw out a parallel that Sarah actually just raised with regard to Australia. The very high natural gas prices they experienced in the state of South Australia and Victoria were the result of a lack of sufficient pipeline capacity to move gas from where it's produced to where it was needed. That is something that will happen in perpetuity until either capacity is added or storage options are added in the region. And I've had some conversations with the foreign minister there about this, and they're looking at all of those issues. The thing that they run into, though, constantly is local opposition to anything related to fossil fuels. And so they continue to push back on anything until the price jumps, and then they realize, well, this isn't really a viable option. And it's led to some interest in developing floating regas capability to backdoor the end-of-pipe constraint that exists to access those markets. In a lot of ways, that's what Everett serves currently in the New England market. It serves as a way to sort of backdoor that end-of-pipe market when you have demand rise because it gets very cold, for example. Interestingly, as was just pointed out, this past winter we saw a cargo of Russian LNG that was reloaded in the UK land in Boston, and I know that got some people's hairs on edge, right?
Thank you. It didn't affect me, but
Well, no,
if I could, I'm running out of time. I just want to ask one international kind of question. We use sanctions a great deal in our country now with major oil and gas producing countries like Iran, Russia, Venezuela. How is that working, and what are the effects of that? I know Ms. Laidlaw mentioned that, but particularly the other three panelists. Or we can hear more from Ms. Laidlaw.
It depends on which sanctions and where. I will say that the sanctions that we are putting back in place on Iran will be quite effective. The reason why these sanctions are so effective, or will be so effective, is that they're focused to the U.S. banking system. And so you can't clear Iranian oil or gas through the U.S. banking system. Given that the dollar is the reserve currency, that oil trade happens in dollars, that makes it extremely difficult for them to sell abroad. And so that sort of sanction is extremely difficult to get around. You may see it some, particularly with respect to the Chinese, who can do some trade without using dollars. But I think those sanctions will be incredibly effective in cutting exports from Iran.
So I think financial and energy sector related sanctions have been very effective when they're implemented multilaterally, because it doesn't just make the sort of air from this part of the balloon go to some other place, right, which happens with oil quite typically. I think the longer term issue is what's the long term consequence for a intensely global industry that has to deal with. I don't know when Russian energy sanctions or financial sanctions will ever go away. I don't see an end to that. And so countries around the world are looking for ways to work around them. And so it's creating a whole different sort of alternative system of financing and technology and a whole bunch of other things for countries that would really just like to stay away from our ability to reach them. That's a long-term problem, but I do think it's one that we've got to keep on the horizon, particularly when we don't know when the sanctions will go away.
Great. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Once again, thank all of y'all for being here. I have the philosophy, I'm for everything below the ground and everything above the ground. I'm for all of above and below. We haven't talked about several of those like renewables and wind power, solar energy. We'll do that at a later hearing. When I was in India and talked to the foreign minister there, the foreign minister kept saying 1,300,000,000 people. And finally it dawned on me that there's 1 billion more people in India than there are in the United States. That's a lot of folks, and I think I saw every one of them when I was over there. The conversation was about getting LNG from the United States to India. We can set, and I agree with you. The United States looks at energy differently because these companies are all in the business to make a profit, capitalism, if we can use that word, as opposed to nationalized energy companies. But it does have the geopolitical effect as well as maybe an not the primary objective, but it does have that objective. And so can you highlight for me selling natural gas, where we are with India? My understanding is we can develop it, produce it, send it across the ocean, and sell it to them, and they can buy it cheaper than they can drill it themselves, and we still make a profit. So where is that going? Dr. Medlock, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks for the question. I think you're touching on something that's actually bigger than just India. Currently, when we have discussions about geopolitical influence of the U.S. energy renaissance, we tend to want to focus on what's happening in Europe with regard to Russia, because that's sort of the thing that's hot button, it's very relevant right now. But if we put a longer term view on this, you quickly come to the realization that if I just put my hands on a map around China, India, and the ASEAN countries, that's 3 billion people in a part of the world that's growing at a clip of greater than 5% a year. So for the next 20, 30 years, that is the engine that's going to drive the shape of the energy landscape globally. The better we can connect with rulers in that part of the world, with industries in that part of the world, with individuals in that part of the world, the more influence we'll actually be able to have over over how that sort of, or all those geopolitical relationships ultimately shape. That will actually convey tremendous benefit to the U.S. government and its people, quite frankly, as we go forward over the next 2 to 3 decades. Moving beyond that, we still haven't even touched on, if we're going to do the math, another 3.3 billion people that live in sub-Saharan Africa, live in Latin America, live in Central Asia, the Middle East. You're talking about a massive number of people outside of where we conventionally talk about or traditionally talk about trading oil and natural gas that we have the ability to reach, make contact with, begin to shape and influence discussions around energy, around foreign policy, et cetera. And energy is a great way to do that because energy is the go of things, to steal a quote. It is the thing that drives economic engines around the world, and it will always be the case. Regardless of the form of energy, it's always going to be important.
I was recently met with speakers of the House of Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, and they are working together to move more to the West, to democracy, et cetera. What is the United States doing energy-wise for those 3 specific countries? Anything, or are we developing in their own resources? Are we selling them our fuel? Does anyone want to comment on those 3 specific countries?
I don't know each of them individually in a great deal of detail. My understanding is the strategy is threefold. One is to sort of help with the internal governance, particularly in Ukraine, of their domestic energy system, which has been sort of fraught with oh gosh, a whole bunch of different problems. Two is to make sure the interconnections and the market within Europe is as efficient as possible and can work those countries into the system. And then the third is dealing with Russia vis-a-vis energy supplies into Europe and making sure that they have sort of a level playing field for negotiating prices. Can't speak too much beyond that, though.
Dr. Medlock?
Yeah, if I can add one thing to that. I think the strategy really has been one of trying to promote a different type of governance around markets that allow for more flexibility in the delivery of different types of supply. So this ultimately allows for this credible threat hypothesis that I mentioned earlier to be realized in Europe. So this gets to liberalization of markets, actually seeing price signals that are transmitted across the European continent that allow for expansion of pipeline capacity connecting different points of entry into the continent, allowing backhaul services to move from Western to Central to Eastern Europe, which didn't exist really to any extent just a decade ago. All these sorts of things have actually allowed more flexibility and fungibility of gas molecules in the European market. And that's really the best you can do absent a direct point of contact. The Ukraine, there's no ability to import LNG into the Ukraine, so U.S. gas isn't going to land there unless it lands in India and moves via backhaul by pipeline. Same thing with Moldova, Romania, you name all those countries in that sort of block, right? It's a similar sort of issue. So it really is about altering market structure and conveying the advantages that a different market structure will actually bring in terms of providing energy security. And this is fundamentally a trade question.
I think Mexico and the United States and Canada are intertwined dramatically in the energy field. Dr. Medlock, there's a small business guy in Houston that has all of it. He's a manufacturer, he's an assembler, he has all his little parts made in Mexico. They're brought into his business in Houston. He assembles them, then he sends them out through the Houston Ship Channel. Of course, we get fuel from Canada as well. Let me hear just what all four of you think on this basic concept of, we can call it free trade, regarding energy and energy supply, this energy supply chain. You think it's a good idea? You think, what do we need to do to make it better for our economy? Each one of you can comment on it. All right, Mr. Carroll, we'll start with you.
I'll just put it in perspective from the natural gas side throughout North America. If you look at it as a unit, we get about look at U.S. demand, about 7% of that is actually imported from Canada. There's a net on that in terms of we send them some, they send us some. And about 7% of our production goes to Mexico. So it's, if you could look at it as 93% of what we produce, we consume. But there is some movement between the continents. And it's the integrated North American market, I can tell you, is the envy of the world. So there's a lot of power and competitive advantage based on the way that mechanism works.
Yeah, I think
Ms. Ladisall.
super boring issue of sort of standards and policy harmonization, which has always been kind of boring for, from a policy perspective, is something we can continue to do, particularly as we're inventing new technologies, digitalization within the electric power sector. All of these things, we have mechanisms, trilateral mechanisms between all three countries to be able to do that. I just think we need to continue to do those things. I see more threats to the integrated North American economy from the way that we're approaching the NAFTA trade arrangement right now, but also steel tariffs, other things that are broadly discouraging for companies that really would like to have a North American frame of mind. The other big threat is actually one that Representative Keating brought up, which is infrastructure is challenging in all three countries right now. And I think what we need to do is look at particular places like the Gulf Coast area or the Northeast or even, sort of the West Coast, where we've got really big advantages from a resource base or from a technology and innovation standpoint, and try and build kind of regional innovation hubs, regional energy hubs, where we understand how the infrastructure and the educational and university environment and the business environment can all sort of paddle in the same direction towards really making the most of those advantages. And I just don't think we've thought that way yet.
Ms. Gross?
I agree with everything my folks to the right of me have said, but I'll add just an additional point. it's really also a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer from a trade and economic perspective. It's also a no-brainer from an environmental perspective. Anytime you're taking these products and shipping them to nearby markets, that's a real advantage. You're also allowing Mexico to take advantage of the significant natural gas reserves that we've had here. The Mexican energy sector has significantly restructured recently and allowed much more outside participation. It's bringing more renewable energy, and the gas is a fantastic partner for that. And so not only is this good for the United States, good for, good to have a regional energy system, it's also good from an environmental perspective. I think we can give it 2 thumbs up from any number of points of view.
Dr. Medlock.
I think Sarah's point's a fantastic one, actually. The integrated nature of a North American market conveys massive amounts of opportunity, both on the environmental front and the commercial front. Commercially, you connect markets, you connect consumers with producers, you actually make those transactions lower cost, which actually helps grow businesses, does all sorts of things that are fabulous for job creation, wealth creation, et cetera, on both sides of the border. Environmentally, you've actually seen in Mexico, and Sam was just referring to this, you've seen in Mexico a reduction in fuel oil use and power generation. Why is that? Well, it's because you've got low cost natural gas that's being produced just north of the border, and it's moving south. And it's being put into natural gas combined cycle generation facilities, and it's allowing Mexicans to actually reap the benefits of the North American gas boom, just like we do in Texas, just like we do in Massachusetts, just like we do anywhere. So those types of benefits, actually, when they're conveyed broadly as a result of trade that can actually occur unimpeded, are tremendous on both commercial and environmental fronts.
Well, thank y'all. Appreciate your being here and also your expertise. It's fascinating to have all of y'all here to enlighten us about the way things really are. So it's very good. Thank you, and this subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.
That was a big theme.